The Israelites had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. This is because they had gotten to the Jordan River and looked across, but they refused to go into the land and accept it. They said the people there are too big, too tall, we'll just be destroyed by them. And so they rejected God's promise of the land, and they said, no, we don't want to go, let's just go back to Egypt. God said, all right, if you don't want the land, I'm not going to give it to you. So they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years. The entire generation of adults died off. Everybody 20 years and older was dead. And so they circled around, but at the end of 40 years, the next generation had grown up to replace the previous. And that's where the book of Deuteronomy comes in. Before we actually get into it, though, a little bit of historical background here. At the time, there were a lot of nations in the area of Canaan and in the Middle East. And of course, from time to time, those nations are probably little, city-state type things. They would go to war against each other, and they'd try to conquer each other and rule over each other. And when a battle would be completed and one was victorious, oftentimes, or at least sometimes, the winner would decide that they wanted to rule over the loser. In other words, we won the war, now you have been defeated by us, and so we are kind of in charge, and you are kind of not in charge because you lost. And so they would come to an agreement and come to a kind of, they'd set up a contract between themselves. The winning king would be in charge, of course, like I said. He'd be the one setting the rules. In fancy terms, they call this and the other guy, the losers, they would be submitting to the king. So the winning king of the winning city would be in charge, and now he'd kind of be ruling both towns. And the citizens and the rulers of the losing city would be in subjection to the winning king. All right, that makes sense? Everybody okay? Fancy terms, they call the winning guy the suzerain party. He's the victorious ruling party. And he would kind of set the rules. He'd lay out the terms of agreement for the loser guys, and the loser guys was known as the vassal party. I didn't make those words up. Those are the fancy names they give them in books and stuff. So it doesn't matter if you remember those names. It's not a huge big deal. The vassal party, the surrendered submissive party. And these two parties would come together. Obviously, the winner would have most of the negotiating power because he's the winner. But they would sometimes set up a contract between them. And this contract would define the terms of the relationship between them. And so the winner would say, all right, I am in charge of you, and because I'm in charge of you, you will work and you will pay certain tribute to me usually. You'll follow these laws, and here's what we do, and here's what we do, and here's what we require, and you must do this for us, and you have to pay us so much percentage of your crops, or your gold, or whatever it is every year, and you have to be loyal to me, and if we go to war, you have to help fight for me, and all these other things you have to do for me as the leader. And in return, I will also give you things. If we are attacked, I will help protect you. I will help defend you. I will, I'll help maintain law and order in your area. These are the things I will do for you, and these are the things you will do for me, because I have conquered you, and now you're living under me, and there's a certain contract that we're going to set up. Because one was the suzerain party and the other was the vassal party, we call this a suzerain-vassal treaty, right? This is the treaty between us. This is how the two of us will relate. These are the terms of our contract, the conqueror and the conquered. And the conquered will serve the conqueror, and the conqueror will protect and help organize and structure the conquered. Everybody got that okay? And we can see this sometimes when, even in the Bible, when Israel would go out and fight people and they'd conquer people, and and other battles and wars that we see within the Bible, this type of thing taking place. Which brings us to the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? Keep all this in mind because we're going to come back to this suzerain-vassal treaty in just a second. The book of Deuteronomy, just prior to their possession of the promised land, God formalizes his covenant with his chosen people. Deuteronomy, even the name, of course, D-E-U-T, means, does anybody know off the top of your head? Like 1,000 brownie points if you know what this means, because we had to look it up. Deut, D-U-T, means second or number two, and onomy is just a statement, right? Astronomy or whatever, a statement about the stars or our beliefs about the stars. So Deuteronomy, the second statement, obviously this is the second statement of the law, because we've already seen God give his first statement, his first presentation of his law to his people, didn't we? That was back in the book of Exodus, yeah, and some in Leviticus and stuff, a little bit in Numbers too. But that was the first round to the first generation of Israelites that were brought out of the land of Egypt, and they went to Sinai, and they crossed the Red Sea, and they came across to the Jordan River. That was the first generation of Israelites, and God presented his law to those people. And if you remember back then, we said they signed on the dotted line, they completed the contract, there was the sprinkling of the blood, and they ate the meal together, and they did all the things. They got the written tablets from Moses. And they agreed to the terms of the contract, but when it actually came down to it, they got to the banks of the river, and God said, all right, here's the land I'm going to give you. They said, on second thought, I think I want to renegotiate this contract. We don't want to follow your commands anymore. We're out of here. So God said, again, fine, you go wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and I will bring back your children, and they will accomplish what you refuse to accomplish. Well, now we're in the generation of those children. And so God represents for the second time his law to the people. Again, why the second time? Why the second giving of the law? Because it's the second generation of Israelites. The first refused to close the deal, and now the second generation will, hopefully. Of course, we know it will from biblical history. But Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. The author of the book, of course, is Moses. The readers are Israel, the second generation, the ones that will actually cross the river. And the message which I just read before this, if we could summarize the book, just prior to their possession of the promised land, God formalizes his covenant with his chosen people, the second generation. The structure of the book is something we just talked about a minute ago. It is actually written in the form of what at that time was a well-known format, this suzerain vassal treaty. And that's really the format and the structure that the book of Deuteronomy is given in. And just by the structure, without even reading the first word of the first verse, we have an idea where God is going with this, aren't we? Because within this suzerain vassal treaty that God is presenting to his people, who is the suzerain? Who is the conquered ruling party? The conquering ruling party is God himself. The conquered submissive party would be the Israelite people, absolutely. And so God says, there is a treaty format that you're all very well familiar with. You know what this is about. You know how it goes. So I'm going to present with you this suzerain vassal treaty where I am the superior ruling conquering party, and you are the, I don't know if defeated in this term is quite right, but you are the submissive party to me. I will set the rules. I will tell you how life will go. I will tell you the expectations. I'll also tell you what I will do for you in return, how I will protect you, and I'll provide for you, and I'll structure you, and I'll take care of you. And we're going to set up this treaty, and you're going to sign, on the bottom line again, as the second generation, sign this contract, this treaty format that you're so familiar with. So here's the typical structure of one of these treaties, and the structure of Deuteronomy as well. First of all, you have kind of the preamble, the introduction. That takes place in the first 5 verses. Historical prologue is the next section. That's where the treaty lays out the history of the relationship between the two parties. Here's, in secular terms, you'd say, here's the war that led to this treaty. So-and-so attacked so-and-so, and they fought this battle, and they fought that battle, and here's what happened, and this party lost, and this party won, and that's what brings us to this point where we're at today, and this is why this treaty is being written. Okay, kind of a reminder of the circumstances that led to the treaty being written in the first place. That's the historical prologue. That's chapter 1, verse 6 through chapter 4, verse 43. Then we start getting, getting into the stipulations. These are the rules that are being set forth within the treaty. This is kind of the meat and potatoes. This is the bulk of the book here. This is what is required of the vassal. This is what the submissive party must do for the ruling party, and also a little bit of what the ruling party will do for the conquered party, but mostly what is required of the submissive party. Start out with general principles in chapter 4, verse 44 through 11:32, and then down to specific regulations in chapters 12 through 26. You notice that's a really long section. Again, that takes up the bulk of the book. The general principles is kind of the heart and the purpose of what the rules are going to be about, what we're trying to accomplish by all of these, this whole treaty, and the attitude and the mindset of both parties, and then the specific regulations are the actual details of the laws that are being set forth between the two. Following that, we're going to look at the sanctions of what happens if all goes well and what will be provided again by the ruling party, by the suzerain, and also the cursings. What will happen if you disobey? In a secular situation, if you rebel against the conquering king, here's what we will do to you. We'll come in, we'll burn your towns down, we'll kill all your people, your animals will all be ours, that type of thing. In this situation, it is what God will do to his people if they disregard his law and they rebel against his authority. Here's what I will do to you as a people. Finally, the end, just like any good contract, you have to have witnesses to sign this. And so witnesses are provided in chapter 29 and 30. And finally, the last section, preservation of the covenant. Here's how this is to be perpetuated down through the generations so that generation 3 doesn't have to go through all this all over again. This will be the final signing of the law, and this will be perpetuated throughout all the generations. You'll pass it on from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, and here's how this is to be perpetuated from here on forward. Now, there are 3 parts that Deuteronomy provides that aren't as typical of a treaty back then, but these are tagged on for, well, I call it our benefit or whatever, because this is not just a typical treaty. Next one, prediction of Israel's future failures. Most treaties would not have this if this was just a secular document between 2 countries. You wouldn't usually say, I know you're going to fail, and so here's what we're going to do about it, or here's how it's going to look. But God, of course, being the omniscient God himself, who he is, says, I know you people, I know what you're going to do. When you come into the land, you will turn against me. And so here's how life will look for you when you do. Next, blessings for the tribes, we'll look at those. And finally, the death of Moses is provided for us here, which again would not be typical for a secular treaty of this type, but in God's case, it was. He includes an account of the death of Moses, and I think this is really a fascinating chapter, how he treats Moses at this time. So if we're all ready to dig into the terms of the agreement, doesn't it sound exciting? It'll be a good book. Here we go. First off, the historical prologue. The historical prologue is the section of the treaty where the suzerain gently reviews for the vassal why they are the vassal and how they got to be the vassal, their defeats in the war, their initial defiance of the suzerain, and the suffering caused by their resistance. In other words, here, vassal, here, conquered party, this is why you are the conquered party. Here's what led to your defeat. In secular terms, this would be important because it kind of puts the vassal back in their place, doesn't it? This is why you are the little guy. Let's not repeat this mistake again, shall we? That type of thing. This is why you have been defeated. It's the suzerain's opportunity to remind the vassal of who is in charge and who is setting the rules. In this section of Deuteronomy, God defines himself as Israel's suzerain for the reasons mentioned in this section. And here are some of the things mentioned in the section, and we'll look at just a couple of these. This recounting of Israel's past is followed by admission to follow the commands that God is about to give. And as we look through the first several chapters, the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy, around in verse 9 of chapter 1, it talks about how they appointed leaders over Israel as they're leaving Mount Sinai. Then they wander through the wilderness to, not the 40-year time, but they go from Sinai to the Jordan River, the banks of the river, and they look across, but they refuse to enter the land. They send the spies across, they come back, spies give a negative report, and the people agree with the majority, and they decide we don't want to go across. And so the penalty for that rejection is wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. So he recounts how they go off and they wander through the wilderness for 40 years, and how the entire generation died off as a result of God's punishment upon them. It talks about the rebellions along the way, how they rebelled here and they rebelled there and they grumbled here and God had to punish them there. Kind of a recapping of all the things they did wrong that led them to this point, right? Which is typical for this type of treaty. If you would have rebelled, if you would have accepted the first time, if you'd have done what was right, if you'd obeyed my commandments, you would not have been in the situation, or you could have saved yourself all this suffering all throughout the past several decades, but you didn't. You chose to rebel. Even so, in the last half of chapter 2, it talks about the defeat of the 2 enemy kings on the eastern side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, how these 2 kings came to war and they attacked Israel, and even though Israel had no trained army per se, God protected them. He handed them and their lands over to the Israelites, and Israel won those battles. Again, not just a historical retelling, but as a reminding of God's provision for them, how he's taking care of them. Again, the suzerain taking care of the vassal's interest, because now Israel belongs to God. They are his possession. They're his property. And just like any good property owner, they take care of their own property. And so God's going to take care of his people because he owns them. Continuing on, it even recounts in short style how Moses was forbidden to enter the land because they were grumbled so much and they were so rebellious and so hard-hearted, stiff-necked. And Moses, even himself, the leader, got up in front of the people and he disobeyed God in front of the people out of his own frustration and anger. And so because of this, even Moses, the great leader of these people, the intercessor between the people and God, the one that God talked to face, even he's not allowed to enter the land because of what he did. All these failures listed out in the first 4 chapters. Continuing on in chapter 4, Moses and God turns their attention to the people, and they start addressing them directly and say, now you have to obey, you have to follow these laws. In chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "See, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, 'Surely this nation is a wise and understanding people.' For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? And what nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all of these laws that I have set before you today?" He says, obey these laws so much so that when all the nations that surround you look at you, they say, what? They say, "Wow, what an amazing God you have. What in the world, what other nation in the entire world of all time has a God that lives with them the way that your God lives with you?" He's right there. He protects you. He provides for you in such a physical way. And he sets up this society with the rules in such a way that there's fairness and equality and compassion upon people and consideration of the poor and those that aren't able to care for themselves. What an amazing God you have. This is such a strong contrast to what we have in our society. You must have an amazing God, it says. That's the purpose for all of these things. And he reminds the people of all these things and how they're not to turn to other gods and they're not to follow the gods of the people who in the land who they're taking over, because their gods are inferior. And if you do that, this will be a breach of our contract and we'll have to punish you. Finally, he kind of closes out the section in chapter 4, verse 32. He says, For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on earth, and asked from one end of the heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out in the midst of the fire as you have heard and still live? Rhetorical question. The answer is no. How many nations on the earth got to hear their God speaking to them audibly out of a fire or anything else for that matter? And not only lived to tell about it, but even heard them talking at all? None, because all the other gods are false, right? Verse 34, or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Is there any other God like our God? Has any other God ever on the face of the earth done what this God has done? No, not even close. Not even close. This God, he rescued Israel, who was just a group of slaves in Egypt. He pulled them out. He broke the sea open so they could walk through. He rained down absolute terror upon Egypt to get them out. He spoke from the fire at Sinai. He gave them the 10 Commandments. He guided them through the wilderness with a pillar. All these things he did. No other nation has ever had this happen for them before. God setting himself apart from all the other gods. Verse 35, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land for an inheritance as it is this day. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. There is no other. Therefore, you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Again, God's reminding them of who he is and of who they are. God says, I have done all these things for you. I am the one and only mighty God. There is no other God like me. You cannot compare me to anybody else. And because of that, you are a people. Because I drew you out, you're existent. You owe your very existence to me. Your fortunes, your survival, everything, your very existence as a nation, you owe to me. That is why we're setting up this covenant. That is why you are to be submissive to me, to follow my laws and my commands, because you owe everything to me. I am in charge. And you are to do this not only now, but for future generations, for all time. So all these things he does. He talks about the spies, he talks about the 40 years punishment in the desert, God's protection of Israel against Sihon and Og, his provision for them east of the Jordan, all these things. And here's that passage I just read to you. I should have read it off the screen, I guess, but I didn't. But this big, long passage, this is who I am. This is what I've done for you. Don't forget who I am, because that's the basis of our relationship here together between you and I. This big, long passage that I just read to you. And this is the whole purpose for the treaty in the first place. This is the historical prologue that brought us to this place of signing the treaty today. The next section we get into is the stipulations, starting out with the general principles. And I got to be honest, as I read through this and preparing for it, and I tried to read through read through everything and try to pick out what I want to read up here and what I don't want to read and all that. A thought came to my mind. Sometime, maybe, I don't know, I'll have to decide. Sometime we ought to have a Sunday school class where we just pick a book or two or three for the quarter, and I do nothing but just stand up here and read the entire book. Would that be interesting? I'm not sure. Would people get bored with that, or would that be really neat? I'm not sure. But as I read through this section, it's just fascinating to hear about the care and the power and the mindset and the attitude of God towards his people. He just lays it all out here in really, really fantastic terms. He gets into the specific laws later on. That's the next section. But just the general overall concept of who God is and why they should follow him and why they should listen to him and what he's done for them and how he cares for them and what his plans for them are in the future going forward. It's just a fascinating passage. And if you want to read through it on your own, I'd obviously definitely recommend that. But here are the different sections within it. And we'll just kind of skim through these in a really quick way. Starting out in chapter 5, we have what we notice is the Ten Commandments again. I thought we already saw these back in Exodus. Exodus chapter 20, yeah, everybody knows about Exodus chapter 20 as being the Ten Commandments. Did you also know that they show up in Deuteronomy chapter 5? For whatever reason, I'm not sure why, Exodus 20 seems to get all of the attention. Whenever you talk about Ten Commandments, it's always Exodus 20, Exodus 20, Exodus 20. And that's fine, but it's also repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Why would God repeat it in Deuteronomy 5 if it's already in Exodus 20? Because this is a deuteronomy, isn't it? A second giving. So a lot of these laws you'll see repeated from earlier on, but he's reiterating it to the second generation of Israel. And so here it is, chapter 5, verse 1. Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire. Well, I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did go up to the mountain. He said," and here we go, verse 6, "I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me," number 1. "You shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything else," verse 8. "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy," verse 12. "Honor your father and mother," verse 16. "Don't murder," verse 17. Verse 18, "You shall not commit adultery." Verse 19, "Don't steal." Verse 20, "Bear false witness." Verse 21, "Shall not covet your neighbor's stuff." It says there's all 10 commandments, and he lays it right out there in summary form. He continues to talk about how he appeared to the people, Verse 32 says, "You shall be careful, therefore, to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you shall possess. Follow these laws, and everything will be well for you. You'll be safe, you'll be secure, you'll get to live in the land I've given you a long time." And by implication, if you don't follow these laws, all these things will not take place. That brings us to chapter 6. Chapter 6 contains a very, very well-known passage. I pick it up in verse 4, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and talk with them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Now, was he really after all the graffiti that he's talking about? You have to scribble these things everywhere, on your doors, on your forehead, on your hands, and everywhere, and you just have to be writing all the time? I think literally doing that wouldn't be a bad idea, but what was he really after? My law shall be integrated into every part of your life. This isn't something you just do on the Sabbath day or do every now and then. My laws should integrate and infiltrate every single thing you do. When you walk down the road, when you come home from work, when you sit down to eat, when you leave the house, when you're walking beside the road and you're just talking to somebody. It should just infuse everything that you do and affect every aspect of your life. That's how this should be. And in this passage here, he gives what the New Testament identifies as the number one most important commandment of all, right? It's not found in the 10 Commandments, but love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, mind, and strength. Number one commandment right here. He continues on, verse 12. "Take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. You shall serve him, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people who are around you. For the Lord your God is in your midst, a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from the face of the earth. Please, please follow my commands. Obey what I'm telling you so that I can bless you, so it will go well with you, so I can keep you safe and protected and give you all the things that I want to give you." He continues to reiterate these things throughout the next several passages. Chapter 7, verse 6. "You are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you are more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with one who hates him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment and the statutes and the rules that I command you today." Please follow these commands. Fascinating here, it says why he chose Israel out of all the others. He didn't pick the best and the brightest, right? If I was God and I was going to choose a nation, who would I pick? Well, I'd probably do a quick census count. Yeah, you guys are the biggest, and you have the best technology, and you're the best behaved, and you're just, the most attractive nation, and so I'm going to pick you. That's probably how I do it if I was God. God didn't do it that way. He said, you were a ragtag bunch of losers in the land of Egypt, but I cared about you, and I had a covenant to keep with your fathers, with Abraham, so I drew you out, and I made you my people, and I will turn you into the greatest nation on earth. Not because of anything you are or did, but because I love you, and I'm keeping my covenant with you, and I want to show my glory and my power through you to all the other nations. Can you hear just God laying it all out there, just opening up for his people, who he is and why he cares for them? Please come to me. I want to protect you. I want to I want to be your God. Not in a begging sort of sense. God never begs people to follow him like he's a desperate, please just like me, just like me. It's not like that. But he's offering himself to his people. I am the one and only. Come to me. I want to care for you. And I want to be your God. He continues to remind them not to forget who he is. Chapter 8, verse 2. You shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Don't forget, he says. Continuing on, verse 11. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and rules and statutes which I command you today. Unless, he says, when you get into the land, you're going to get comfortable and you're going to get complacent. You're going to forget all the things you've been through and you're going to turn away from God and start to follow the idols. He says, don't do that. Again in verses 18 and 19. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Please follow me. Do what I'm telling you to do. He warns against rebellion throughout chapter 9. Verse 7 in particular. Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. Don't forget what happens when you rebelled. From the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. God says, you don't have a good track record. Remember all those times that you rebelled against me, how it went for you. You got plagued, you got punished, you got beat up, you got defeated. Don't do that when you get into the land. Continuing on, encouragement to serve God in chapter 10, verse 12. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? What is God really looking for in order to please him? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I'm commanding you today for your good. It almost sounds like that verse out of Micah, doesn't it? 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God? God says, look, I'm not overbearing. I'm not over-demanding. All I'm asking is that you obey the commands I give you and follow me and love me. Is that really too much to ask? It's really not. It's not burdensome. I mean, there's rules and stuff to follow, and we'll get to those, but all I'm asking is that you be faithful to me and obey me and follow me. He continues on in chapter 11, verse 1. You shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, its rules, and his commandments always. Consider today all the stuff you've seen, and then he goes down and again lists all the stuff that God has done for them. Finally, he kind of summarizes some of the blessings and cursings here in chapter 11, pick it up in verse 8. You shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land that you're going to possess, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them, to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are entering to take possession of is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you're going to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. God's always watching over this place. He's always keeping track of it. Verse 13, if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give you the rain for your season, rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil, and he will give grass for your fields and your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. Take care lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Then anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens, so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you'll perish quickly off the good land that the Lord your God is giving you. Blessing if you obey, cursing if you resist. Over and over and over he reiterates this. And again, it just kind of struck me as I was reading through this. We so oftentimes think of the Old Testament, especially the books of the law, as just a just a sequence of rules, and it's all about the outward conformity. You have to follow this, you have to perform that, you have to obey this, and do this ritual, and dress like this, and talk like this, and do all the outward stuff. And there is some of that for sure, especially in the Old Testament law. But underneath that, the whole motivation behind it is what? This passage that we just went through here. It's all about loving the Lord your God and serving Him and wanting to be His people and wanting Him to be your God. That's the motivating factor. It's not just a random, arbitrary bunch of rules and regulations for the people to follow. It's very, very cohesive, and it all comes together to accomplish that one purpose: loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and following and obeying Him, and having that relationship with Him. And that's why I like this passage so well. So before God addresses the outward obedience in specific regulations that we'll get to in a minute, He gave an instruction to the inward attitude and the mindset of this people. And that's what I want to really point out in this passage. Again, he ends in chapter, chapter 11, verse 26. He says, "See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I'm commanding you today, and go after other gods that you've not known. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal." What does that mean? Keep that in mind. We're going to get to that probably next week. We're going to come back to these two mountains again at the end of the book. But he said, keep in mind all these blessings that I promised you and all the curses that I also promise you. Obedience, disobedience. And when you get into the land, we're going to enunciate these very, very clearly and very plainly so you understand one more time as you enter the land, kind of like a final reminder as you go in to take the land that He promised to them. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to those mountains. The next section, more stipulations. These are the specific regulations. So this section, containing the specific regulations for the Israelite, kind of makes up the bulk of the book of Deuteronomy. And honestly, when you think about the book of Deuteronomy, this is probably the section that you usually think of, all the laws and the rules and regulations. The laws here cover a broad range of topic about marriage, dietary rules, tithing, festivals, courts and law, war, social rules, etc. It's an incredible list of regulations, not only in size, but also in the fairness, the justice, and the compassion that it includes. It is truly a unique method of government for Israel, especially in comparison to all the other violent and ruthless nations of Moses' day. The law could only have come from the loving, merciful, just, compassionate Yahweh. By agreeing to these terms, the covenant is complete. This is the binding contract between the suzerain Yahweh, God, and the vassal Israel. God concludes this section of His treaty with an admonition. And we'll read that in just a second. But as we go through these passages and chapter after chapter after chapter of rules and regulations, some of them are obvious, some of them are totally common sense, some of them are instructions in worship and how they are to behave in society to God. Some of them in our day and age and culture just seem almost a little downright silly. Just a quick sampling of a few of those. Chapter 14, verse 22. Talking about tithes of the people to God. He says, "You shall tithe all the field of your seed that comes from the field by year. And before the Lord your God, in the place that He will choose to make His name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, of your oil, and of the firstborn of your herd or your flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." In other words, the first tenth of your crop that comes up, you are to present before God, but not just burn it on the altar. You're to take it to what would later become known as the temple, and you're to sit down there and to eat. You're to have a meal with God. You're to go to God's house for supper, essentially. And it's a carry-in. You're going to carry in your own food, but you're going to bring in the first tenth of everything and just take it and eat it and basically have a party at God's house is really kind of what it comes down to. Just have a festival and enjoyment time to remember that it is God who's giving you this crop and this plenteous bounty that He's provided for you. So the first tenth that you bring, you're to present before God and sit there and eat it in His presence. Verse 24, "If the way is too long for you, if you live way out in the boondocks, clear up on the northern end of Dan, clear on the north end of the country, and it's just a long way down to the temple, and you cannot carry all this stuff all the way down there," he says, If it's too far for you, so that you're not able to carry the tithe, when the Lord your God blesses you, because he gives you so much you can't even carry it all, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place that the Lord your God chooses. In other words, take that tenth, sell it wherever you are, take the money, and then go to the temple for the same party. And once you get there, verse 26, it says, spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. And you shall not neglect the Levite who is within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. He says, sell your stuff, take the money, go into what would later be called Jerusalem. Buy whatever you want, whatever you feel like eating. Now, does this sound like a strict and angry and uptight God to you? Not really. What is he really after? He wants the fellowship, he wants the recognition, he wants the gratitude and appreciation of his people. So he says, if you live too far away, sell your stuff, take the money, go to Jerusalem, buy whatever you feel like eating. He says, I don't care. What you want, a Big Mac, you want some steak, you want some lobster, shrimp, whatever, pasta, go Italian, I don't care. Whatever you want, at whatever restaurant you want, go to it, get carry out, and come and eat it with me. I just want to have a meal with you. I want to enjoy your presence. I want to maintain that relationship with you. I want you to remember who I am and that I'm the one providing for you. Doesn't that sound like a horrible God to live for? Isn't that awful? Boy, he's such a stickler. Boy, these poor people. Wouldn't you rather live under Baal or Molech or something like that, where you have to burn your kids alive in the fire? Wouldn't that be better? Yeah, or you have to dance around and cut yourself to get their attention? Wouldn't that be better? Or would you rather have a God that says, why don't you come and just have a meal with me and we'll have a party at my house? And again, I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean, it's not a casual thing at all, but this is what God is really like. This is what he's after. He says, come and fellowship with me. Oh boy, he continues on talking about the Sabbath years. He talks about the Passover, a bunch of the festivals, the Feast of Weeks, continuing on into chapter 16. Feast of Booths in the middle of chapter 16. How about this? Chapter 16, verse 16. It says, 3 times a year all of your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of the Booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessings of the Lord your God that he has given you. In this passage, God says, every male of the nation is required to go to church how many times? 3 times a year. What about every Sunday? Well, first of all, Sundays weren't a thing back then. Second of all, there was one church building in the nation. That was in Jerusalem. And he is aware that travel is difficult and stuff, so he says, you're required to come to my place 3 times a year. And he lists off those 3 times. And when you come, you're to appear before me not empty-handed. You're to show your appreciation to me, and you're to come and visit me at my place. Continuing on in the chapter, he talks about justice, warning against idolatry and stuff like that, legal proceedings, discussion about priests and Levites. It continues on. Chapter 18, verse 20. We'll read another example or two, and then we'll be done. Chapter 18, verse 20 says, he's talking about prophets coming up, and Moses says, at some point, at some time, another prophet like me will rise up before you, and you must listen to him. He says, but in the meantime, there will be a bunch of false prophets. Verse 20, but the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, that's God's name, that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. If a prophet comes along speaking from God, obviously listen to him, but he said there will be false prophets, and if it's a false prophet who doesn't speak what I told him to speak, you have to kill him. He's a false prophet. Verse 21, and if you say in your heart, well, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? How are we supposed to tell the difference between a real prophet and a false one? Well, God doesn't expect us to be gullible or just guess. He tells us how to tell. Verse 22, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true that he speaks, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him, and then you're to kill him. So he says it's easy to tell. Whatever the prophet says, if it comes true, then he's probably from me. If he says something anything that does not come true, he's a false prophet. Pay no attention to the guy. You're not bound to listen to him at all. That'd come in handy today, even in our day, doesn't it? How do you tell the truth from error? A guy comes along and tries to start a cult, claiming to have some special revelation or whatever. So how do we tell? Well, easy. All right, tell me something that you would not be able to know without supernatural insight. And then we'll see if it comes true. Predict the future for me. See what you can tell me. And then we'll wait and see. Such and such comet is flying by the earth and it's going to announce the end of the earth and we're all going to be killed or something like that. Has the end of the world come? And I say that because we've seen so many of those over the last several decades. The world's going to end on such and such a day, and it's going to be signified by a flipping of the calendar or the flyby of a comet or some other sign is going to come along and happen, and the world's going to come to an end. And you know what has not happened? The world has not ended. You know what? Those were false prophets. How could I tell? Because what they said didn't come true. So he gives them a way to discern between truth and not truth. Oh boy, we're still in the middle here. I have some other examples I really want to read to you, but we'll have to get that next week. So next week we'll continue through a few of these specific examples of commands that God gives. Again, these are fascinating too. I'd really encourage everybody to just read through these on your own. Some of them really make you think. But remember, they're all from God. None of them are in error. But some of them really make you think. I encourage you to do that. But we'll continue that next week. Let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, I thank you this morning for this book, this covenant you gave with your people. There's not a lot of stories in it. There's not a lot of humorous narrative here that we can kind of get into. It's a lot of law, a lot of statement, a lot of instruction, and yet it's absolutely valuable in terms of learning who you are and what your heart is toward your people, and also what your people's heart are towards you. We know that you're very generous with them, you're very fair, you're very patient and compassionate with them, and of course we know from history that they did not return that to you. They were very faithless, and they turned away from you once they entered the land, just like you said they would. I pray that we learn from what you say in this book and also from their mistakes. Not that we live by the law today, because we do not. You've fixed that situation by sending your Son, and yet we can still see a lot of who you are from this book and your heart towards people, and help us not to miss that as we read through these laws. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Thank you very much. You're dismissed.